Hello there and welcome to part 2 of my guide on how to paint the Zombicide Rio Z Janeiro add-on pack zombies. As you can see, this time we're using the more flamboyant ones, the sort of more carnival ones. And to begin things off, I coated everything with some Colourforge matte white spray. First thing I'm going to do is use some Barrowhearth blue to paint in the trousers of the brute. And I'll also use the same colour to paint his sash as well. Both of these will then get a coat of arithmetic blue. Apologies if I mispronounced that, I'm terrible with names. And while that dries, we'll move on to the two walkers. I'm going to use some grey cere to paint the trousers of one. I'll also paint his cuffs on his shirt. And I'm also going to use grey cere to paint the feathers on the other walker as well. All of these will then get a dry brush with some Army Painter matte white. After that I went back to the brute and used some Barrowhearth blue to start layering in the first highlight. And for the second I did a 50-50 mix of Barrowhearth blue and matte white. I then painted his shirt with rust grey, his coat and his hat with Macragge blue, and there's a couple of bits of trim that I also painted with Hearth blue. Then everything we just painted had been given a wash with some Drakenhof Nightshade. I'm going to try and keep the two walkers with the same sort of colour scheme, so I painted both their corsets with some pink horror. I then used Emperor's Children to paint the hair and the bottom parts of the male walker's trousers. And I also used it for the sleeves of the female walker. All these areas then got washed with some Carroburg Crimson. Moving back to the brute, I then went and relayered his shirt with some rust grey, which is then highlighted with a 50-50 mix of rust grey and matte white. I then did a 50-50 mix of Calgar blue and Macragge blue to do the highlights for the main jacket. And then reapplied the Hearth blue just by itself. This was then mixed with matte white for a 50-50 ratio to do the one and only highlight. I then used Morghast Bone to paint the more flamboyant areas of the jacket and the shirt around the brute's neck. This was then all washed with Army Painter Soft Tone. Pink Horror was used again just to quickly relayer the corsets on both the models. I'm not going to go any more detail of that because there's not really much space for the actual colour. I then relayered the Emperor's Children to make that nice and bright. This was followed by a 50-50 mix of Emperor's Children and matte white. And then finally adding a little bit more matte white to the Emperor's Children for a 70-30 mix for the final highlight. I painted the feathers on the male and the puffy upper sleeve area of the female Xerxes purple. I painted the ruffles on the male and the bottom of the corset on the female with some Slanesh grey. I then painted the sleeves on the males with some Warp Fiend grey. All of these areas were then given a wash with some Druchii violet. While that dries, we're going to move back to the brute and we're going to relayer the sleeves and the ruffles on his area with some Morghast Bone. Followed by a 50-50 mix of Morghast Bone and Ushabti Bone for the first layer highlight. And then Ushabti Bone just by itself for the second. The brute has some areas that needed some gold trim, so we're going to paint that with some Retributor armor. These areas are the sash, his scepter, there's a little bit around his crown, and finally the trim on the ruffled parts of his jacket. Then we're going to wash the crown and the scepter with some Reichland Flesh Shade. The soles of his shoes are going to be painted with some Dryad Bark. The main body of the shoe will be painted with some Baneblade brown. His shoes will be then washed with some Agrax Earthshade. Well, that wash dries, we'll move back to the purples. I'm going to use Xerxes purple again on the purple areas just for the first highlight. Use a paintbrush for the female, but however for the guy, you want to use a small dry brush and be very, very careful just to make sure you don't mess up any of the areas we've just painted. This will then be followed up by a second dry brush of a 50-50 mix of matte white and Xerxes purple. The sleeves will be relayered with some Warp Fiend grey. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Warp Fiend grey and matte white. The areas we painted Slanesh grey will then be relayered with Slanesh grey. This will then be followed up with a highlight of a 50-50 mix of Slanesh grey and matte white. Then going to paint the male's hat and the female's leggings with some Wazdaka red. Both these areas then get a quick wash with some Carroburg crimson. While that dries, we'll move back to the brute, and I'm going to highlight all the gold areas with some Uruk armor gold. And then I'll relayer the shoes with some more Baneblade brown. I'm going to use Wraithbone to start painting in the details of the male walker's shoe. Then I'll use Dryad Bark to paint the bottom of the shoe. And all those areas will then be given a wash of Army Painter Soft Tone. I'll then use some Wazdaka red to relayer the areas of the hat and the female's leggings. Next, we're going to paint the ruffles around both the walkers' necks with some Nurgling green. I'm also going to do two of the flowers on the male walker's legs, one on either side, as well as a few of the dots around the walker's corsets. I'm then going to use Elysian green to paint the frogs that are dotted around the male walker's belt. And all of those areas we've just painted green will be given a coat with some Athonian camo shade. Next, I'm going to start working on the baubles, and I'm going to use Blue Horror to begin with and pick and choose wherever I feel like. And these will be given a very thin wash with some Drakenhof Nightshade. I'm then going to use some Tau Light Ochre for some orange. Again, pick and choose wherever I feel like. These will be given a thin wash with some Frugan Orange. Then I'm going to use some Dawn Yellow to paint some yellow dots. Followed by a thin wash in those areas with some Cassandora Yellow. And then finally, for the remaining dots, I'm going to use some Slanesh Grey. And these will be given a very light wash with some Druchii Violet. This will give the greens plenty of time to dry, so I'm going to go back in and I'm going to use Nurgling Green to paint the ruffles, the dots, and the flowers on the legs as well. Those tiny little frogs will be highlighted with some Elysian green. And then I'm going to use some Nurgling green just to highlight the chin and the bottoms of the feet just a little bit more. Moving back to the baubles, all we're going to do really now is just re-highlight what we've already done. So we're going to use Blue Horror on the blue, Tau Light Ochre on the orange, Dawn Yellow on the yellow, and Slanesh Grey on the purple. I should have mentioned earlier, I also, when I used the Slanesh Grey, I also painted the other two flowers on the male walker's legs as well. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the belt of cuddly toys. So the first colour we're going to use for the dogs is some Ushabti Bone. There's a heart-shaped one on the side of him, so we're going to use some Gothel Brown for that. Followed by a little bit of Ushabti Bone to paint into the centre of the area. All of this will be given a coat of Army Painter Soft Tone. Very sorry about the blur, didn't actually notice when I was filming. While that dries, I'm going to use some Nagaroth Night to paint the top of the male walker's sock. This will then get a quick highlight with some Xerxes Purple. And the bottom layer just above the shoe is going to get painted with some Corvus Black. The dog should now be dry, so I'm going to go in and relayer with the Ushabti Bone. And this will be followed up with a highlight of Screaming Skull. The heart will be relayered with some Gothor brown. And then we'll relayer the small bit of Ushabti bone we painted earlier. There's a little human plushy character in the centre of the belt, also on the back as well, so I'm going to use Mephiston Red to paint in his jacket very carefully because I want to leave the middle bit to be white because that's how it looks like on the card. And I'm also going to use Mephiston Red to paint the baubles at the end of both the feathers on the male walker and the female walker. All these baubles will then be highlighted with some Evil Sun's Scarlet. Going back to the teddies around the belt, I'm going to use some Dawnstone to paint the trousers of the little guys. Then Cadian Fleshtone to paint the face, which will be highlighted with Kislev Flesh. I'm going to paint the hair black with Abaddon Black. I'm also going to paint the little shoes as well. And I'll highlight the hair with the tiniest amount of Corvus Black. There's another thing strapped to his belt, which I can't quite make out from the artwork, so I'm going to paint that with some Mephiston Red. And that'll be given a coat of Army Painter Soft Tone. While that dries, I'm going to start work on the markings on his hat with some Avalanche Sunset. Now these are just kind of like different little swirls and lines and things like that, so that's all I'm going to be doing. I'll then highlight the red I just painted with some Evil Sun's Scarlet. Here's a step you can skip if you want, but I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to paint the noses on the dogs and the eyes on all of the little cuddly toys. Be very careful if you're going to do this and take your time. If you make a mistake, don't worry too much about it because you can just repaint it over. On the plushes that are on either side, they're strapped to him via a little bit of white rope, so we're going to paint that in now. And while the white is out, I'm going to paint the middle part of the sock as well. The banding that goes around the middle of the hat. And then finally, his shoelaces. I'm going to paint the buttons on his shirt with some Armoran Blue, which will then get a highlight with some Temple Guard Blue. The clasp on the corset of the female walker I'm going to paint with some Retributor armor. I'm then going to start work on the flag that's through her stomach. I'm going to paint it as the Brazilian flag, so I'll start off with some Warpstone Glow, which will be washed with some Beltan Green. While that dries, I'm going to move on to the skin. We'll use Mechanicus Standard Grey for that, followed by a wash of Reikland Flesh Shade. That's given the flag plenty of time to dry, so I'm going to relayer the Warpstone Glow, but I'm going to keep out of all the recesses. I'm then going to mix in some Moot Green for a 50-50 mix to do the one and only highlight. This next step you're going to have to be very careful for, or it's another step you can skip completely if you wish. I'm going to use some Avalanche Sunset to very carefully start marking in the diamond shape of the Brazilian flag. And this will be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Flash Git Yellow. For the blue circle, we're going to use some Macragge Blue. Be very careful again. Start in the centre and then just widen yourself out until you've got an area that you think is suitable enough. And finally, I'm going to use some matte white just to mark the white line that goes across the blue. Next, I'm going to use a couple of coats of thinned down Dawnstone to start layering in the flesh and highlighting all those muscles. Then I'm going to use Carroburg Crimson to mark in the eyes and areas around the teeth. And I'm also going to use it to mark around the edges of all the big pustules on the Brute. Brute has got some jagged bones jutting out of one of his arms, so I'm going to use some Morghast Bone to paint those, which I'll then highlight with some Screaming Skull. I'm going to use some Balor Brown to then paint all the gross, disgusting pustules on the Brute. And then I'm going to do a 50-50 mix of Balor Brown and Screaming Skull for the highlight. I'm then going to use some Pallid Witch Flesh to paint in the eyes and the teeth. And then for extra grossness, I'm also going to add a tiny little dot of Pallid Witch Flesh to all those big, gross, disgusting pustules. Make it look like they're nice and ready to burst. I'm then going to paint the pole that's sticking out of the female walker with some Iron Hand Steel, and wash it with some Nuln Oil. I'll also paint her hair with some Abaddon Black. That will also get washed with some Nuln Oil. Pearl necklaces, I'm going to use some Mephiston red to paint those, which they'll be highlighted with some Evil Sun's scarlet. I'm going to paint her shoe with some Nagaroth Night, which will then be washed with some Druchii Violet. Her tiara will be given a coat with some Retributor armor, which will be washed with some Reikland Flesh Shade. I'm then going to paint the top of the Male Walker's hat with some matte white. Now, the art in the book has some face paint on the Male Walker, so I'm going to use the matte white to gently dab that into place. I'm not going to go and paint the whole face with it. It's just going to be a very soft sort of dabbing, just picking out sort of cheeks and things like that to make it look like the paint has actually worn away slightly. Now we can move on to the bases, and I'm going to use some Dawnstone to paint the base. This will need a couple of layers. I'm then going to use an old brush to stipple in some Corvus Grey around the Dawnstone, followed by some Grey Sear. Then I'll use some Corvus Black to draw in some cracks into the concrete. Some Abaddon Black to paint the rims of the bases. And that'll all be given a wash with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. These last two steps can be skipped if you want, but I'm going to give everything a quick coat with some anti-shine matte varnish. That way it'll help protect them when they go back in their box. I'm then going to use some blood for the Blood God to sort of gore them up a little bit. I'm going to put it on their little hands so it looks like they've been digging in around their mouths and any open wounds or anything like that. And a few splashes here and there just for a little bit of colour. For a little bit of extra grossness, I'm also going to use some Nurgle Rot around the Brute's mouth to make it look like he's eaten too much and he's maybe puked some out as well. I really like that looks. I want to mix it in with the blood for the Blood God so it sort of blends in a little bit nicer. And there we are, that's the final 3 zombies done for the Zombicide add-on. Really fun models to paint, however they are quite complex, so if you're new to painting, take your time with it. Don't worry about making mistakes, and don't worry about going into too much detail. You can always come back later. It took about 8 hours to paint these guys because of the amount of detail that's on there, but they were quite fun to paint, so all is forgiven. If you enjoyed this video and it helped you out, I'm really glad, and I hope you subscribe for more. Goodbye for now.